Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event from Jesus College and the Intellectual Forum. It is a great pleasure to have you here, whether you are here in person in this fantastic Frankopan Hall, or you're joining us online, wherever in the world you are, and do keep coming in if you're here in person. Some of you I know Jesus College extremely well. For some of you, this may be your first time, but it has an amazing history, which is appropriate for the subject of the talk. We were originally set up as a nunnery in 1144. We became an all-male college in 1496, something we corrected about 45 years ago. And over that many hundreds of years, we have had a huge range of people who have worked, studied, and thought here, who have made a difference around the world in many, many fields. One could talk about Archbishop Cranmer, who changed religion, Malthus, who thought a lot about population and has had a huge effect around the world, Lisa Jardine, our first female fellow, who is an absolutely inspirational figure in just so many areas, or more recently, Clean Bandit. Some of you at least know Clean Bandit and Rockabye. They've had billions of watchers. There's an age profile to the people who know this, so but they were all here. The Intellectual Forum was set up in 2016 to try to help showcase some of the work that's being done, some of the thinking, and to get people to talk about some of the biggest issues of our time. We're particularly interested in interdisciplinary work, and our speaker tonight absolutely exemplifies that. Now, one of the first events that we ran was timed to fit in with the inauguration of President Trump. We had a range of experts, including a specialist in psychoanalysis, including a political historian, to talk about what had happened and why. That is not the subject of tonight's talk. The Madman in the White House is definitely not a reference to any current or immediately former presidents, whatever you may have thought. It goes back further. And I'm really delighted to invite Patrick Weil here to talk to us tonight about his work. He has an amazing history, and I could spend the entire allotted time just talking about the things he's worked on, the prizes he's won, and so forth. Originally a lawyer, he properly studied law and then fell accidentally into history. Out of law and into history, and then sort of fell back into law again. And so now has positions in history at CNRS in Paris, in Yale Law School, a fairly prestigious law school, Yale and Harvard, some of the better spin-outs that we've had from Cambridge, and they seem to be doing quite well. And has done so many things. He's won prizes for British legal history, scooping all the Brits, and so much more. So we could talk about all of those tonight, but tonight we're just going to talk about this amazing work that he discovered, what we can learn from it about that madman in the White House, Woodrow Wilson. Patrick, thank you so much for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Julian, for your invitation. Thank you to Raphael, to Charlotte, to Molly, who has made this invitation possible. I am very happy to be back to Cambridge, because I've been to Cambridge working in the Keynes papers at King's College. And there are some other reasons why I'm happy to be here, because in addition to the Keynes paper that provide me very interesting material, and I will come back to it. So Raphael was my research assistant when I discovered this manuscript, unknown manuscript of Sigmund Freud, and American ambassador Bullitt in the Yale archives. And I had some handwritten material of Sigmund Freud, written in Gothic German, and Raphael, who is a Swiss German, was able to help me with a lot of work to translate in English this material. And also, I don't know if he's in the room, Tony Lantin, with whom I have corresponded by mail, has been an incredible intellectual support, and I will come back to his work while presenting my own work. So, in fact, you were right to talk about Trump. Trump today is often mentioned even by high-level former leader of the Republican Party as narcissist or even mad, and it's a language that is really used. In fact, it was used about Wilson by people who worked with him or knew him in the last month, in the last year of his presidency. And in fact, so I discovered randomly, I don't want to elaborate much on that, I can respond to questions about that. I discovered this manuscript of Sigmund Freud and William Bullitt on President Wilson. There was a book which was published in 1966, but when I compared the original manuscript, which was signed by the two authors at the end of each chapter, with the one which was published, I could see 300 cuts or revision, and that was the start of the investigation. How did these two guys happen to work together on Wilson? Why? And why at the end, the signed manuscript was not the one that Bullitt, who published it in 66 before dying a few weeks later in February 1967 in Paris, why did he censor it? And that is the story of this book, which forced me to study the Treaty of Versailles, which is the main focus of their work. And then I discovered that I knew I had not the knowledge of many important facts of this treaty. And I will mention them, and maybe you don't know them either. So as much as probably you know that the League of Nations was an institution that preceded the UN, there was also a NATO that was created by the Treaty of Guarantee, which was a treaty signed by the Prime Minister of France, the Prime Minister of England, and the President of the United States, that was attached to the Treaty of Versailles, but collapsed because America didn't sign the treaty. So that was something I didn't know. And for Clemenceau, for the French, which main focus was the security and not the reparation, the collapse of the Treaty of Guarantee was an absolute catastrophe. Then the other thing I didn't know, it is that if you look to the facts, I've heard that the Republican blocked the ratification of the treaty in the Senate in the US. And this poor Wilson, who was a good man, of goodwill, was faced evil in his opposition. But the reality is that at the end, Wilson ordered the Democrats in the Senate to vote against the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles, because there were some reservation, and what was the main reservation? It was that, I summarize, that in case of declaration of war, the President of the United States has to respect the US Constitution and go to Congress to get authorization. It was not something, and Wilson was saying, I agree, but I don't want it to be written in the reservation, and for that reason, he ordered the Democrat to destroy the baby he has created himself, because he went to live in Paris for 6 months. He arrived in France in December 13, 1918, and he left France at the end of June. He had a small trip in February to the US. So you cannot imagine today any president, I mean, even the Prime Minister of England going to live abroad for 6 months to create so he destroyed his own baby. And the last thing I didn't know, until I made my research, I believed in Keynes' book, at least in the tones of Keynes, that put the responsibility of very high reparation on Clemenceau and of his Carthaginian peace. In fact, the high reparation came from the Brit, came from claims coming from the British delegation, and especially, and where obtained by the South African member of the delegation, which was General Smuts. And I come back to that because that's a story that makes my book a little British too, and you will see how. So, as I mentioned, during the negotiation, and when Wilson came back to the US, and before he had his stroke, many of the people who worked with him felt he was unbalanced or he was mad. He was not rational in the way he was working with his Secretary of State, so that his main advisor House, and Keynes was the first who spoke about his Freudian complex. In fact, Keynes edited a first version of his book, and I will tell you few edits he made. He had written, "What a great man came to Europe and what a small one has gone home." And it read now, "What a great man came to Europe in those early days of our victory." And instead of needling Wilson as under-equipped intellectually, the published Keynes described Wilson as lacking the dominating intellectual equipment that would have been necessary. He described him 5 times as ignorant, and he changed it to ill-informed. He was no longer unfertile, but unresourceful. So even the description by Keynes of Wilson was, the strength of his judgment was diminished by the edit he made on the first draft of his printed book. But he wrote that he had a Freudian complex. And it's only later, much later, that William Bullitt, who was a young diplomat in the American delegation that came to Paris. So he was born in a wealthy family of Philadelphia. He had a European background. He would speak French at lunch and learn German. He had a family in the UK. For example, he was a cousin of Nancy Astor, and he was also was a nephew of a very famous professor of medicine called William Osler, who was professor at Oxford. So he had, and he was a friend, he became friend with George Lansbury, one of the leaders of the Labour Party, and also Harold Lasky. So he had British connection, and he was on the radical left. He joined Wilson after having been a journalist investigating in a honeymoon trip in the Central Empire and reporting not only to his readers but to the State Department about what he saw in 1916, the summer of 1916, in the Central Empires. And he would be the head of the enemy bureau after the entrance of the US in the war in April 1917, and will be in charge of dealing with the liberal, the socialist, the Bolshevik in the State Department. So he joined Wilson, and he's in charge, he's this special US envoy to the Bern Conference, which gathered all the socialists of all the European different countries and the US in Bern in February 1919. And he's so successful that he's sent to us in a secret mission by Colonel House, who was the advisor of Wilson for Foreign Affairs, and by Lloyd George and his advisor, Philippe Thiers, as to try to find a way to bring the Bolshevik in the negotiation. And he came back with a proposal of truce signed by Lenin with a deadline April 10, 1919. And Lloyd George is very interested, and Wilson doesn't even want to meet him. And so the deadline passed, the proposal fell down, and he became very frustrated, and he resigned when he saw the draft of the treaty, and he became a vocal activist against the ratification of the treaty. So he's called by the Republican to give a testimony in the Senate. He told the story of his mission to Lenin, but he also told the Senate that Secretary Lansing, who was the Secretary of, has told him that if he was a senator, he would vote against the treaty. So that put a big mess in the ratification process. Lansing doesn't deny it because it's not untrue. The testimony is not untrue. At this time, politicians don't lie as much as they do today. And a few days later, Wilson has a stroke, and there is a first vote not ratifying the treaty in November 1919. Keynes' book is published in December, and then there is a last vote in March 1920, and the treaty is rejected. After his testimony, of course, Bullitt is out of politics. He writes a novel that sells 17, there is 17 editions about the decline of Philadelphia. It's not done, but he's frustrated by the trauma of being so hopeful of Wilson's potential achievement and the collapse of the American diplomacy that he writes a play about Wilson's psychology, and writing it, he decided to visit Sigmund Freud. He has been trained in psychology at Yale College. He has himself small or big psychological problem. He has been married with a beautiful lady of the bourgeoisie of Philadelphia. He divorced her because she could not have a baby. And then he married the widow of John Reed, Louise Bryant, who is a very famous journalist and militant of that time, with whom he had a daughter, but he would later divorce from her in 1930. So he had his personal problem. He visited Freud, and he's known by Freud because his resignation from the American delegation, his testimony in the Senate has been making the headlines in the Austrian press. And so Freud takes him as a patient, and I think they talk about himself, probably, on the couch, but also about Wilson. He finished his play after he finished his first psychoanalysis. The play is great, but it cannot find any producer to make it played in Broadway in the following years. So in 1930, he comes back to Freud because he has a project of writing about diplomacy, and Freud has told him he would like one day to write about Wilson. So he comes to visit him in Berlin. He says, "Are you ready to write a piece for my book?" And Freud say, "Well, I am ready to write something with you if you bring evidences, enough evidences on which we can rely to write something." And so Bullitt spent the summer of 1930 reading all the books written already on Wilson, but collecting incredible new testimonies. He got testimonies from Wilson biographer, Wilson secretary, Wilson doctor, Wilson chief of staff, etc., etc. And also, he got access to the diary of Colonel House. Colonel House would take every day, would dictate notes to his secretary of what happened during the day. And Wilson has this particular character that he was a man who was talking to some of his intimate friends, like you talk today to a psychoanalyst. So he will speak about his nightmare, his anxiety, his whatever, and Bullitt find incredible material. And the material I found made me title a chapter, The Princeton Nightmare. Because, in fact, until the middle of a second term, when he was President of the United States, Wilson could not sleep well, could not stop. Once he has finished doing the business of presidency, he would talk about Princeton. he was absolutely obsessed by what happened to him when he was not student, he was a student, not professor, he was also a professor, but the president of the university. And so, what happened to him in Princeton? So, in fact, there is a testimony of his biographer, Ray Baker, who says, Wilson had to have a woman at home and one much-loved friend, and then could be hard as steel to any man outside that circle. That was a very smart observation. In fact, he had a best friend with whom he would share everything. He was a professor named Heben, who would become also president of the university later. And he would, if you read the letter he writes to Heben, they are a letter of love, French, very, 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 very intimate and passionate, I would say, friendship. And what happened is that one day Wilson started his presidency with a big success. He modeled his reform on Cambridge and Oxford. I think it's Oxford, sorry. On the tutorship instead of teaching in classroom, etc. And then he wants to do a larger reform, which is to suppress the dining clubs, which still, I think, exist in Princeton. And Heben said, I don't agree with you. He says, that's not a problem. It will not break our friendship. But the day of the faculty meeting, Heben speaks supporting a motion against the reform. And at that moment, the love is transformed in hatred. An obsessive hatred, a trauma that he cannot deal with for years. When he dies, he had the property of a place for a tomb in Princeton Cemetery. But he has told his wife he didn't want to be buried in Princeton because he had so bad memory of the place. So just a footnote, he didn't want to be buried in Arlington because he thought the land has been unfairly confiscated by the federal government from General Lee, who was his hero. And so it's why he's buried in the Washington Cathedral. So another reason of his bad memory with Princeton, it is that as much as he needed a loved male friend, he created a staunch enemy. And this enemy was also in the faculty. He was the dean of the graduate studies, Dean West. Dean West has the project to develop the graduate studies who are not developed in Princeton. Wilson supported him, but could not stand the fact that he was becoming successful, that he was getting a grant from Procter, from the company Procter & Gamble, and so he organized a rejection of the grant until the board of Princeton discovered that he was lying, that anything that would make West project of building a graduate program successful, he tried to destroy it, including by saying that it was not the Princeton policy, but West policy that the board was facing in the proposal West made. And he said, the board said, but you signed the preface of this project. He said, I didn't read. And then the board member found that he has edited the text of the proposal himself. So he was about to be fired because he organized a campaign against Princeton in the United States. Because Princeton has not accepted the reform of the dining clubs, it was, etc. So he organized a political campaign against Princeton. He was about to be fired when he is chosen to be the Democratic candidate for governorship in New Jersey. And then, I stop the story there, he became president. What happened to him in Princeton happened to him during the peace negotiation. So Heben has been replaced by Colonel House. Colonel House, he loved him. There was no one like him. There are the memoirs of the butler of the White House, who have been seeing like 10 different presidents, and he said he has never seen a relation. He said every president has a best advisor, whatever. He has never seen a relation of that intensity between Wilson and House than when he saw. So House was the man he loved. It was his mind. He said, "You are like my mind," until he became an obsessive enemy at the worst moment for the peace of the world, because it was in March 1919 when Wilson was negotiating with the British and the French about reparation and about the German borders, etc., etc. Then, who was Dean West? It was the leader of the Senate, the majority of the Republican majority in the Senate, Henry Cabot Lodge. Cabot Lodge was a scholar, older than Wilson, and Wilson admired him. He quoted him 3 times in his most famous book, Congressional Government. Cabot Lodge published his first academic article. Nevertheless, again, it's normal in field of politics. Cabot Lodge expressed a disagreement after the sinking of the Lusitania about Wilson, and then at that moment he became an enemy so obsessive also that Wilson ordered all his cabinet not to attend any meeting with Cabot Lodge, and he said you cannot sign a document where you would have this evil signature on the same document. So that was one of the problems with the reservation adopted by the Senate, that it would be having the signature of the leader of the majority in the Senate. So what was the interpretation? And I will not reveal everything now, because I will reveal everything in a few minutes. At that stage, when what we can read in the book, in the printed book, it was the exaggerated love of Wilson toward his father. I can I mean, I don't want to quote it. I don't want to be too long, but I can quote you some. For example, when he arrived in Paris for the peace negotiation, his doctors say, "You have reached a level of importance in the world that your father now is." No, my father will be always higher than me, even if I am now negotiating the peace of the world, etc., etc. So they had this testimony, and this expression of, I would say, absolute love in psychoanalytical theory cannot camouflage often an anger or an aggressivity that is not expressed, as our sentiments are always balanced, I would say. And this aggressivity was transferred to these father figures, Dean West, who are older than him, Dean West in Princeton, and Cabot Lodge in the Senate. Now, the love, so he, to deal with his father, he had to deal with the arrival in the family of a younger brother, which is always difficult for the elderly brother. So he became protective of the younger brother and loving him a lot. Also, you have a lot of, but in fact, he never accepted equality between brothers and between students. When he was at college, at high school, college, university, he was always creating a covenant of the Association of Basket. He was permanently writing the statutes of the, so he would be the superior, the protector. He would never he could not stand the claim for equality coming from younger person he officially loved. There was, so for example, when House starts becoming the negotiator in his name in Paris while he's in the US, something breaks there. And when Heben takes the floor in the faculty meeting, suddenly he became his equal, or that is absolutely unacceptable. That is what you can read in the book, in the Princeton book. There is something you can read also which is quite interesting, because it reflects a divergence between Freud and Bullitt. One day, Wilson read an article while he's a student in Princeton, and he wrote to his father, it was about Gladstone, and the oratory talent of Gladstone in the House of Commons. And he wrote to his father that he has discovered he has a mind. And at that stage, he decided to become a politician. So Freud thinks it's about getting out of masturbation that exists among the adolescents, etc. And Bullitt has a Lacanian, I would say, and I think much more interesting interpretation, that he suddenly could obey his father without obeying him. His father wanted him to be a minister of the church, and he decided to be a prime minister. And in fact, he wrote a book called Congressional Government. And one of the first things he did when he became president is that he went in person to Congress to read the State of the Union speech, which has not been read since Jefferson, like a prime minister. So he had in some way find a way of escaping the domination of his father by identifying himself to a prime minister. Then, and that would collapse, and I'll come back on that, during the peace negotiation, and that was a testimony of Lloyd George, he identified himself not only with the Christ, but with a better Christ than the Christ. Because Lloyd George report, and I think I want to read you this passage. Well, Lloyd George report that one day he is meeting with the chief of state, chief of government, and Clemenceau, and he says, the Christ did well in principle, but he missed the implementation. So I'm here to correct this mistake, etc. And at that moment, and Lloyd George said, I look around, I saw the black eyes of Clemenceau, were all these Christians in a room looking at this man who was claiming he was better than the Christ. So he was, as Freud has interpreted, because he has his identification to his father, he was the son of God, but he was also God himself by his identification. So he would say, the Christ, you did not enough. I am correcting you now with this League of Nations. But that, as you know, collapsed. So that was, they finished their manuscript. Then Bullitt is called by Roosevelt to negotiate the recognition of Soviet Union by United States, which happened at the end of 1933, to become the first ambassador of the United States in Soviet Union. And then he discovers Stalinism and becomes a staunch anti-communist and the leader of the anti-communists in the State Department for the next 30 years. But then he is moved to Paris, where he will be an ambassador until 1940. And he will, with Jean Monnet and with the Brit, has an incredible impact, starting in 1938. I would mention two stories. First is to create a program. He called Jean Monnet because he remembered his job during the First World War of merging the British and the French activities in buying raw materials. And so he contributed to the creation of the same body run by Jean Monnet in London, and in the US there is the British representative, to buy aircraft and war material to try to compensate the advance the German has taken in the building, for example, of modern aircraft. At some point in June 1914, that is not very known. I don't know how much time I have. Okay. There is a guy, Comte de Chambrun, whose mother, through his mother, is related. He's a descendant of Lafayette, and through his mother, he's American. He speaks fluently English, so he's an attaché, military attaché with the British troops. So he's in Dunkirk, and he traveled with the Brits, traveling to, and he saw the battle in the air. And he comes back to Paris, and he meets Bullitt and says, in the aircraft battle, the Brits are winning. Bullitt said, that's extremely important, because Lindbergh has created a depression, and everybody is thinking the German will crush the French and the Brits, and so you need to talk to Roosevelt. I'm French, I am a French officer. Okay, the day after, the Prime Minister of France named him deputy attaché in the American embassy, in the French embassy in Washington. And a week later, he's in Roosevelt office. And he tells the story. And he says, that's very important. Can you come with me on the boat, on the Potomac? I will bring my advisor. He convinced the advisor. And then they meet 30 people, the leader of the Republican committee in the Senate, in the House, etc. And they decided that millions of munitions that were available, and they kept, because they say, if Britain collapses, we need to keep our munition. They decided to send them to the British to support the Brits. So that was the kind of thing Bullitt was doing. But let me read one of his statements in September 1939. Mr. Hitler has already lost this war completely. I rather imagine that he thinks he can finish the French and British quickly enough to turn around and smash the Bolsheviks. But that is not going to happen, and in the end, the Bolsheviks will gradually eat like a concert to Berlin. Then the next stage will be of finishing off Stalin Khan. How? God only knows. So he was able, and when he see the new Vichy government in July 40, he wrote to Roosevelt, the impression which emerged from this conversation is the extraordinary one that the French leaders desire to cut loose from all that France has represented during the past 2 generations, that the physical and moral defeat has been so absolute that they have accepted completely for France the fate of becoming a province of Nazi Germany. Moreover, in order that they may have as many companions in misery as possible, they hope that England will be rapidly and completely defeated by Germany. They hope that France may become Germany's favorite province. It was incredibly prophetic in some way at that moment. So he had a capacity of strategic vision that was enjoyed by Roosevelt until he put him aside, because in 1940, Roosevelt took the control of the State Department, become secondary compared to the War Department, and Roosevelt changed his cabinet. Bullitt is put aside. He cannot, he joined the Free French. De Gaulle put him in the staff of the General de Lattre, so he goes from Toulon to Frankfurt with the French First Army. And when he comes back to the United States, he organized like an independent and freelance Secretary of State, a kind of resistance against communism towards an administration, a democratic administration. He feels is too nice with the strategy of cannons, containment, which seems to him too smooth. So he became friend with Nixon. He's like the Kissinger of Nixon before Kissinger. He doesn't want to publish his book until the death of Mrs. Wilson. And when Mrs. Wilson died in 1962, he waits, and finally he published in 1966. So what did he cut in this book, and why did he wait? So what did he cut? He cut something related to some character of Wilson, and I will read you an important moment of his research with Freud. While working with Freud in the fall of 1930, Bullitt would return to his hotel and take notes of their conversation. And in November 1930, he recorded the following dialogue, opening with Freud. "You and I know that Wilson was a passive homosexual, but we won't dare say it. I said, certainly he will say it, but subtly. Freud answered, that's the equivalent of not saying it at all. And finally, they wrote it 13 times in the manuscript. And in fact, they were not diverging about that dimension of Wilson. There was, for example, Wilson had a chief of staff who was named Malone, and he was a young blonde guy. He would sleep in the same bed than him while he was chief of staff during his campaign for governor of New Jersey. Without any, no hugging, kissing, or caressing, that's the testimony of Malone. He would occasionally take my arm, but always with a strong masculine grip. A few times he put his arm over my shoulders. But one day, Wilson told him, when I feel badly, sore, and gloomy, and everything seems wrong, then I know that my mother's character is uppermost in me. But when life seems gay and fine and splendid, then I know the part of my father which is in me in the ascendance. And so, to one possessing a shrewd psychoanalytical sensibility, the equation of happiness with the father ascendance has a kind of meaning. And in fact, his relation, his passion, when he broke with Hibben, who just took the floor in a faculty building, he didn't break with the guy who proposed the motion. This professor who proposed the motion was named ambassador to Netherlands during the First World War. Hibben became, he wouldn't talk to him. So he had a passionate and love relation to Hibben that transformed in paranoia of persecution that is often create a diagnosis of repressed homosexual sentiment. So, of course, he never practiced homosexuality, but he had this attraction in his character. So why did he cut that as he agreed? My hypothesis is that he wanted to cut everything that has related to bisexuality. It was part of Freud's theory, because, and I think it was his own creation, he has theorized that the Christ is the symbol of perfect bisexuality, because being totally passive to his father, God, the Father, he becomes God himself. And they wrote that in the book. They write that it gives a lot of future to Christianity because it permits to deal with the issue of bisexuality which exists in all human beings. But he wrote this book in 1930. Later, he discovered Stalinism. In the 50s and the 60s, the US was in a Cold War. He thought would become not only cold but hot with Soviet Union. He didn't want any passage of his book to be used against Christianity. Why? Because he wrote it, he said, liberalists cannot fight communism, which is a religion. Only another faith, only another religious institution, which was for him Catholicism. And he met the Pope Pius XII a few times, can face communism. So he didn't want any passage of his book to be used by the Soviet or by whatever against the United States, the free world, etc., etc. That is, for me, the reason why he cut all these passages. Now, let me add a few of my own divergence or discovery while working on this project. Freud and Bullitt have discovered a lot of evidences through Bullitt, but they didn't have the evidences the biographer of Wilson, Ray Barker, gathered, and some others, about the character of Wilson's father. Wilson's father was not only authoritarian, he was also pervert, that's a mention of some cousins of him, and humiliating, especially of Woodrow Wilson, in family meeting. And then that unliked the break he made with some of his friend or sometimes of his enemy, because he broke, especially with his friend, when they speak publicly about him in a humiliating way. If you take House, Hibben, Cabot Lodge on one side and Malone on the other side, Malone broke with him. He had the best position of the federal administration, and he resigned because Wilson has not fulfilled his promise to give suffrage to women. And Wilson couldn't sleep the night after the break, etc. Malone kept the conversation private. He kept conversing with him through mail. It was traumatic, but never transformed in this hatred that we have seen for the others. When Hibben took the floor in the faculty meeting in Princeton, Wilson's sister-in-law said, why did he take the floor? Why did he take the floor? Why did he talk? He could have voted against him without speaking. I mean, Cabot Lodge's speech after the Lusitania was very humiliating. I don't want to go into detail. Because that's what happened in politics. But that is clearly a feature that was not seen by Freud and Bullitt. One feature that was not seen was what happened after he lost his friend House. Freud, and he needed a man, so Freud and Bullitt said he replaced House by Clemenceau and Lloyd George. It's absolutely not convincing. And who put me on the path of finding the man with whom he replaced? Professor Lantin. Because Professor Lantin, in one of his very important books, discovered the role General Smuts played in getting Wilson approved the very high reparation that Lloyd George wanted and that Wilson had refused to give him. And 3 days before he gave to Smuts what he refused to Lloyd George, Lloyd George told him, if you don't give me the reparation I need, I will lose my job. And Wilson said, what a wonderful way of losing your job on principle. And 3 days later, Smuts writes a legal note that he was asked to, and claiming that the pension, civil pension, should be part of the reparation. And Wilson agrees, and his staff says it's totally irrational. And Wilson says, rationality, who cares about rationality? he had approved that, and then he collapsed psychologically because he has broken his ethical standard in some way for the affection of his friend, with whom he shared the writing of the League of Nations Covenant, to whom he gave colonies along South Africa, to whom he welcomed many times in his temporary White House in Paris, and whom he praised as the only person he respected when he gave the last interview of his life in December 1923. So my hypothesis is that he has transferred his love from House to Smuts, and with some major impact on the content of the treaty. So let me conclude with a story which is related to Cambridge in some way. So Keynes wrote The Economic Consequence of Peace, I think, maybe I'm wrong, encouraged by Smuts. And he says that the most terrible moment of Wilson dealing with the treaty was when he collapsed to this note about including the pension in the reparation. But he doesn't mention who wrote the note. Infuriated by this absence of mention, the economic advisor of Wilson, Bernard Baruch, decided to publish the note. Keynes is not only infuriated, he is scary in some way. He writes to Temperley, who was a historian who was in the negotiation, how can he break the secrecy of the archives, etc. He's completely, I don't know the word in affolé. He's a little losing his control of himself about this publication that will reveal the origin of this note. But this book is absolutely unreadable. It's totally boring. It's economic notes. It's probably sell 200 copies, as the Keynes book is, of course, still a bestseller about the explanation of the treaty. So Baruch said he would never forgive Keynes, because Keynes contributed by his writing to the analysis, to make the analysis he made become reality, because his book was read in the American Senate, the fact that it was an unfair economic peace imposed on Germany. Clemenceau played a small role himself, because when he saw the collapse, the first vote, he decided to run for French presidency. And I just discovered recently that he told his military chief of staff, if I am elected, I will go to Washington. And he was extremely popular in Washington because he visited the American troops on the ground. He was speaking English. He was the best. He has been living in the US for 5 years when he was 25. As a journalist, he was speaking fluently English. In fact, he has a second home in London. Whenever he was fed up with French politics and he wanted a place to relax, he would come to London. I don't know if you know that. He was the most Anglo and Americanophile French politician of the last 100 years, more than 100 years. And he was extremely active in this creation of this North Atlantic Alliance that collapsed in the hands of Wilson in March 1920. So Clemenceau was defeated because he rejected the idea of reestablishing the diplomatic relation with the Vatican. That was the world peace was more important than our diplomatic relation with the Vatican. But he was a staunch anti-religious guy, and he didn't want to negotiate with his MPs on that. But of course, Wilson was the main responsible of the collapse of the treaty, we still speak about the Treaty of Versailles, but we would not speak about the UN or NATO if the US were not in. In fact, the Treaty of Versailles was designed by the US around the 14 points by the US president, and the committee of the League that would have dealt with the reparation and with other issues would have been presided by the representative of the United States. The absence of the United States destroyed totally the organization of the security of the world that was designed by the three main leaders of the negotiation. And then we run after treaty, another treaty, Locarno, etc., to try to reestablish a balance that could not be reestablished. And then, in France, Poincaré took control of the government, occupied the west side of the Rhine, and Keynes appeared to be right, when in fact, if the treaty would have been ratified by the US Congress with the support of Wilson, the reparation would have been downsized with the agreement of all the leaders, and we would not have been in a situation. And then we would have also the military assistance France would have of the UK and the US in case of German aggression. So the situation would have been completely different. So to conclude, Wilson has created in the people of the defeat state, first, the illusion of a just and perpetual peace, and with an unfair treaty has armed them with anger. And then he has negotiated a treaty which created some security organized around the Atlantic Alliance, and then he disarmed the Allies. And so he was the man responsible of the disorder that led to the Second World War. Thank you very much for your attention.
Patrick, thank you very much for covering so many fascinating things, the psychodynamics, bits of the history, what might have been different, had a few relationships worked out differently. Just really, really fascinating stuff. I am reminded about some of it that you know what a Freudian slip is.
Yeah.
When you say one thing and you mean your mother.
Yeah, yes.
We do have time for questions from the audience, either here or I'll just have a look online if you use the Q&A feature. Are there any questions for Patrick after that amazing talk? Bill, should we start up here?
First, a quick comment. I'm a graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, and I supported the removal of Wilson's name from the school, but that was mainly domestic because of his radical racism.
Yes.
But your talk has confirmed my good judgment in supporting that change. The question I guess I do have, which you don't touch on here directly, is Keynes and Smuts, because Keynes, in the essays on biography, if I remember correctly, Keynes speaks very highly of Smuts.
Yes.
And Smuts has this kind of unique role in the sort of semi-effort to construct a perpetuation of the British Empire in the aftermath of the Boer War. So he's a figure who I think is neglected in a lot of British history, but there's a book over there that I must read that I don't know. But thank you very, very much for all you had to say. Don't really have a question except the role of Smuts more broadly.
Do you want to comment or?
No, I think
we'll move on to other questions.
Tony has written a biography of Smuts, and I was not, frankly, there was a letter I found in his published letters that he wrote to Lloyd George in the summer of, I think, 1918 or 1917. The American army, they're great soldiers, etc., but the chief is not so good. I think they should split the leadership, and he could stay on the backyard, and you could propose to Wilson that I become the guy was a South African, and he wanted to be, I mean, he has a little kind of megalomania, I would say. So I don't think Royal George followed his request, which I would have not, I mean, I had to work, I worked 7 or 8 years on this book. I don't master everything, but Tony knows better smooth than I do.
Can I just make a couple of points and a question? First of all, I'd like to congratulate Patrick on providing so many delicious tidbits, amuse-gueule, out of what's a fascinating story. And his book is well worth reading, and I hope everybody will read it. Smuts and Lloyd. Oh, first of all, Lloyd George. Just a quickie. You quote Lloyd George's Truth About the Peace Conference. I would merely make the comment that one mustn't take Lloyd George. One must take Lloyd George with a grain of salt. It's a wonderful, and again, another wonderful book. Yes. Smuts, yes. I have to say, I did write about Smuts being the instrument the agent who persuaded Wilson to admit the category of war pensions, which increased the amount of reparations threefold. But since I wrote that, I've come to change my mind. That's one of the advantages that if you live long enough and you're a historian, you can do that. I came to the conclusion that, in fact, Wilson was not so gullible as he was made out to be by Keynes, and that, in fact, his reasoning was as follows, that eventually a reasonable sum would be decided on in respect of reparations, and it was only fair that Britain should get rather more out of reparations. In other words, a larger slice of a smaller pie, and I think that's what Wilson was thinking about. Finally, if I may, unlike my colleague on the other side of the floor, I come with an enhanced respect for Woodrow Wilson, a very great man, admired by many at the time and subsequently. And I think that it's a tragedy to dishonor him by removing his name from the university in which he was president. But that's a personal view. Now, Patrick.
If we could, yes.
Yes,
At some point, let
me
Patrick
get
respond.
to it. Patrick, you've written about a man who wrote a book about Wilson, but like you and like me and like all of us and like every historian, we all have our own biases. And I'm suggesting to you that Bullitt himself was a strange character, and he had his biases as well. So my question is, how reliable, you've told us what his thesis is, how reliable do you think it is?
So, Bullitt is not liked by a lot the people who wrote about the event he was participated in as a diplomat. But I would say for example, his former wife, biographers, Louise Bryant. He's not liked by the Wilsonians because he gave a testimony. He resigned from the American delegation, and then he gave his testimony. And Wilson's wife, and I mentioned it in the book, told that she thought that he provoked the stroke by his testimony because of that. So he is not liked by the Wilsonian. He's not liked at all by the people who work on FDR, because as much as he has praised FDR for the first 8 years of his presidency, he felt that the last year where he collapsed, he didn't have the strength. He collapsed towards Stalin in Yalta, and he abandoned China. etc., etc. You have all this, you know that story. And then I think he even, in 1948, he campaigned for Dewey against Truman. Publicly, he was a Democrat for Dewey. He was a leader. So he is, and then there is the divorce with Louise Bryant, which was a harsh divorce. And then you have a lot of other things. For example, he had a secretary who was an homosexual, and many people, some historian I met, he was in fact a camouflage. So I had all these things on Bullitt, and I really opened my eyes and my work to everything. And I found things that nobody has found until now. For example, I brought the evidence that he's the guy who because he destroyed Sumner Well. So he had an enemy in the State Department. I mean, but since it's an interesting case, and I made that discovery that so Sumner Wells was the number 2 of the State Department, but was a Roosevelt special diplomat. And with Bullitt, the relation was okay until Munich. Because just after Munich, that's a very interesting story I brought. Daladier had lunch with Bullitt. And Daladier came back from Munich saying, we go to war. And he said, if I had 3,000 aircraft, I would not have signed Munich. Bullitt takes the first boat to DC, to New York and DC. The night of October 13, 1938, he spent it with Roosevelt in their office, in the Oval Office. And on the 14th of October 1938, Roosevelt made a press conference. The military budget I distributed is out of date. I want 20,000 aircraft. And he gave priority to aircraft. Only aircraft will deter Hitler. It's very interesting because in France, for example, de Gaulle didn't see the aircraft. And his son just died at the age of 102. And in a book just published, he had a chapter about, my father saw the aircraft a little, etc. It's still a debate. So, I have been through everything related to Bullitt. With this secretary, who becomes the secretary of other diplomats, this secretary writes letters every day. I couldn't find one word of affection, one word, in hundreds of letters. So I discovered that. So Wells, I forgot the story about Wells. So Wells, after Munich, they diverge. But when Bullitt sent this telegram about Vichy, which was prophetic, 2 days later, he's called by the Vichy Foreign Affairs Minister saying, oh, your telegram is great towards us. Yeah. How did he get it? It is because Wells let it go to the Brazilian embassy in Washington, who gave it to the Vichy government, and Bullitt was dead. And he was told that Wells wanted to destroy him. So he destroyed Wells because Wells had harassed young porters and waiters in a presidential train, and he always denied it. He always denied it. I found the proof. I found the evidence. I'm the first to have found the letter his secretary sent to Bullitt's cousin saying, we are going to take care of him. Nobody has found. So I really went after everything. Bullitt, for example, his relation with his wife, Louise Bryant. So she became sick with a sickness called the Dercom sickness. Infatuation of the nerves, awful. And Dercom was a professor at Philadelphia, said to him, I hope she'll die. You should hope she'll die the earliest because it's horrible suffering. They both decide, and that's never been said. that they will fight the illness, so that she will go to Switzerland or to Germany to lose weight and to visit Freud because he thought there was a psychological dimension. So I have brought a lot of new things about Bullitt. If I had found anything related to his some secret things, I would have, of course, made it public. I was not writing his biography, but frankly, yes, he has I say things about his personality that has never been said before, because there is another story, sorry.
We're running out of time, yeah.
Okay.
I was hoping to get more questions in.
There is one story I want to say. His first wife wrote unpublished memoirs about their relation as a couple. And he would talk to his first wife. She was not only a wife, she was his best friend. And he would talk about his childhood, etc. And I brought that in the book about Bullitt. And nobody has ever done that on him.
We have perhaps time for one more question, and only a brief answer, I'm afraid. If there aren't any in the room, then there's one here, a completely different subject. You run the Bibliothèque Sans Frontières. What do they do?
Thank you. So I founded an NGO, Libraries Without Borders, Bibliothèque Sans Frontières. We are operating in 30 different countries. We operate especially, we try to permit access to knowledge to people who are lacking of it, so the poorest, the children, the refugees. We are operating in refugee camps. We have developed, so we try to do the 21st century libraries. So we, for example, we have this box called Ideas Box, designed by Philip Stark, that you can deploy in a refugee camps where people stay a median time of 20 years without having access to knowledge, because only the UNHCR receive funding only to save your the physical part of yourself, not the mind. So but most recently, we signed an agreement with the UN office in charge of fighting violence in context of war. Mrs. Patton, you might have heard of her, because she was the only UN official admitted to visit Israel and to investigate on what happened on October 7. And she found this operation we did for Ukrainian women raped by Russian and who were refugees with their kids in Poland. She said, that's a magic box, it's what I need, because you can have a space for the kid. The kids are like, cannot get out of the box. Then the mother can take care of themselves on the traumatic dimension of what happened to them, and then you have a space for the legal support, and you can have a space for the project for this box. So we are sending books, but we are also at the top of new technology, especially in area where people don't have Wi-Fi. So thank you for asking that. It's half part of my work now. In addition, so when I go out of the archives, I do that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you for the question. Thank you.